So again, welcome everyone. Within the next 1 hour, I will present about the regulatory requirements of autonomous and automated vehicles in the USA. So first of all, I'll briefly introduce about the system in the US. We'll talk about global homologation systems, so the differences between the systems, and then we will come to the main topic, which is about connected and automated vehicles in the United States. And then last but not least, I will wrap that up, and then we will go into a Q&A session. So when we talk about autonomous and automated cars, it's obvious that there are some benefits with these cars. So first of all, talking about the safety of roads, 90% today of accidents and vehicle fatalities is based on human behavior. So this was based on a study in the US. So benefits of autonomous driving definitely should be that the roads should be safer. But also reducing traffic congestion. Because basically it will be more going into the shared mobility, so we will also reduce the traffic. Also, it is about better accessibility. So if the driver no longer needs to drive, then also persons with disabilities are able to hire a taxi autonomously and just use it as needed. And then last but not least, also it's about economic growth. So also we are expecting that we will have new jobs, or we are already having new jobs, because the technology needs to be developed, and that also creates the economic growth. And last but not least, most of the autonomous cars are electrified, and that will also benefit our environment. But there is also still a long way to go. So these benefits will only materialize if the technologies will be introduced transparently and based on the global best practice. So there are still some issues around when we talk about autonomous vehicles. Issues such as lack of regulations, lack of standards, lack of best practices, but also about liability. So in case of an accident, who is liable for it? Was it the car driving, or was it the driver behind the wheel just sitting there and watching? So these questions are still not clarified. So there are still some liability issues which we need to clarify. So now we'll talk about the different approval procedures before we then come to the autonomous cars. So first of all, we have the third-party system. It's also sometimes called as authority system or authority certification, type approval, and this is very well known in the European Union. So as the name is already telling, there are basically three parties involved. One party is the manufacturer, the vehicle manufacturer, OEM. One party is the technical service provider, such as TUV SUD, and one party is the approval authority in Europe, for example. It could be KBA in Germany or any other approval authority. So at the end, the technical service will witness the test or conduct the testing, send the reports to the approval authority, and the approval authority at the end will issue the certificate. And having that certificate in hand means that the manufacturer can basically enter the market on public roads. In contrast to that, we have the so-called self-certification system. And this is very well known in the US. So in contrast to the European system, as you can already see, there is only the OEM, so the car manufacturer. So that means that basically the manufacturer by themselves need to self-declare that they are complying with all the requirements. So at the end, they will sign off that all of the requirements have been fulfilled and that they are compliant with all the regulations. There's only one exception in the US, which is about the emissions. So emissions is the only scope where you will receive a certificate from the authority, but beside that, all of the safety relevant scopes you will not receive a certificate, but the manufacturer needs to sign off by themselves. And then, as you can imagine, there are also mixed systems existing. So in some of the countries, basically the European way, so the third-party system has been adopted, but also some of the self-certification system has been adopted. One example here is Australia with the ADR, so the Australian design rules, where they are basically following both procedures in a kind of a mixed system. So let's have a deep look into that, not only providing 3 countries as an example. So here on that landscape, you can see in blue highlighted, these are some countries following the European system, so the type approval system. There are also countries, there are also countries which are kind of gray highlighted. Those countries do not have regulations in place, or they might not have a specific system they are following. But the majority of them is then leaning towards the European system. Then there are also the self-certification system, which is highlighted here in yellow, orange, which is mainly based in the US, Canada, but also Korea with the KMVSS system, the Korean Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. They're also leaning towards the self-certification system. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there are also mixed systems existing, such as in Metro in Brazil, or ADR, the Australian design rules, as I already mentioned, which are kind of adopting both procedures. So let's now have a closer look to the US market, as this is the topic for today's presentation. So I want to start with the Department of Transportation, which is basically part of the US federal government. So the DOT, the Department of Transportation, basically is responsible for everything related to transportation. Within the DOT, there are several administration offices. One of the offices is the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, the FMCSA, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, but also NHTSA, or NHTSA in short. And NHTSA stands for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And this is the administration we will talk in the next 50 minutes about, because this is the main organization responsible for the rulemaking in the United States. Just that you have the complete picture, there are also 2 further quite important agencies. One is called EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and one is called CARB, which is the California Air Resource Board. Both of them, EPA and CARB, are basically responsible for the topic of environment and emissions, while the NHTSA is responsible for the transportation and safety issues. So let's have a closer look to the system itself. So as I mentioned, the US is organized in a self-certification process. So the manufacturer needs to self-declare or self-certify that they are complying with all the relevant FMVSS, so the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, in place. And the Vehicle Safety Act requires the exercise of reasonable care. So this is already kind of, let's say, room for interpretation, where TÜV SÜD is also supporting that reasonable care is done in the right way. Also, NHTSA encourages manufacturer to conduct the tests as specified and outlined in the FMVSS requirements. And lastly, as I just mentioned, NHTSA do not issue any type approval or approval certificate. So whoever wants to enter the US market with a vehicle, the manufacturers will not receive a certification or an approval, but rather needs to self-declare about the compliance. It's also quite important to understand that the FMVSS, they specify the minimum requirements, the minimum performance requirements. So basically, this is not enough. This is really the bare minimum every manufacturer needs to follow. But I'll come to that in a minute. It should be not only that manufacturers are following FMVSS and the federal requirements, there's also requirements from states and standards existing. So unlike in the European Union, for example, the federal requirements do not override the requirements of every individual state. So if we now talk about 50 states in the United States, you can already imagine that you need to have knowledge about all 50 states as well as about the federal system. So at the end, whatever state you want to enter, you need to basically follow both the state requirements and the federal requirements. And sometimes also it's important to understand that the state requirements can be even more strict compared to the federal requirements. So giving you an example about state requirements. So as an example, in California, as you can see on the map on the left side, California, they have introduced specific state requirements about the rear fog tail lamp. So basically, this is something everyone needs to keep in mind, that depending on the state, you need to verify that you are not only following federal level, but also state level. In other states, there are also requirements like lead wheel weights are prohibited, or even that the vehicle needs to emit a sound. So let's talk about market surveillance, because as I mentioned, having a self-certification system, this is very much about market surveillance. So basically the governmental authority, so NHTSA, verifies the compliance with the regulation through the market surveillance. So after the vehicles are already on the market complying with the FMVSS requirements, basically there will be a market surveillance required, or this will be done by the authority. And in case of any issue, or if they identify any unconformity, they will basically contact the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer is responsible to provide evidence, proof of evidence, that they have complied with the requirements. Otherwise, there are very high penalties as well as recalls. So let's spend the next half an hour about the core topic about autonomous driving and the legislation in the US. So this is a current status about the requirements in the United States. So on that slide, you can see an overview not only about the US, but also about other countries of the world. So you can see, if you compare that about the legislation progress, that the US is, I would say not leading, but at least they are one of the top, basically, countries. But you can also see that Germany, or especially also Europe, is really leading as far as legislation goes. So they have just introduced a new requirement, which is called AFGBV, from 1st of July 2022, which is about introducing level 4 vehicles in Germany, and also there is a EU directive coming up, and Martin will talk about that later today. But now coming back to the US, as you can see, as I mentioned, every state is kind of handling it differently. We'll come to that also later, but you can already see that as far as regulation goes, they're a little behind. So there is no regulation existing today, which is basically about introducing level 4 vehicles to the United States, but I will explain that in more detail on how you still can enter the market for testing or deployment reasons. So first I want to spend one more time on the US federal government as well as state regulations. So basically, as mentioned, the federal government also regarding autonomous driving and autonomous vehicles are regulating these technologies. So federal government NHTSA within the Department of Transportation is regulating basically the autonomous vehicles. But if there are no requirements existing, this would be also the responsibility of the federal government to issue exemptions. In comparison to that, so again, federal government is basically responsible for the safety of vehicles. The states are regulating the licensing and the usage. So in other words, how to operate those cars on individual states. The states should follow the recommendations from the federal government when they draft their individual legislation. So we'll now dive a little deeper into the federal requirements. So first of all, it's important to understand that at that current time, there are no specific federal motor vehicle safety standards existing for autonomous vehicles. So in the United States, we do not have level 4, level 5 requirements existing on a federal level today. In contrast, all the FMVSS existing, they still need to be, or they are still applicable also for the new technologies, but as this is already giving a hint, basically autonomous vehicles are then also subject to the same FMVSS requirements. So think about a vehicle, a traditional vehicle. So in other words, all the FMVSS existing do not differentiate between the technologies. So all of them are applicable for traditional vehicles, but also for autonomous cars. And that also means that autonomous vehicles and automated vehicles, which should enter the market, also needs to meet those safety standards. Also, it is the assumption that a driver is still on the driver's seat. So the FMVSS were written in a way that there is a driver on the driver's seat. But imagine an autonomous car, mostly either the driver is not driving or maybe there is even no driver needed. So if the regulations are written in a way that there is a driver on the driver's seat, you can also already imagine that this causes challenges. So the United States, they do have also certification challenges or basically challenges on how to enter the market with autonomous vehicles based on the previous mentioned items. So the regulatory framework today existing, which is again assuming a driver, same technology, is quite challenging for manufacturers entering the market with autonomous cars. So now I want to quickly give an overview on how new rules and requirements can basically be developed. So always there is an initiating event, and that can be that no requirement is existing for new technologies. That can mean that the regulation needs to be updated, but there must be always a kind of an event. Then the second step is to determine whether the rule is needed, whether there is maybe another rule which is already in place. So always there is a check whether that rule is needed. Then the third step is to prepare the proposed new rule. So in case there will be a new regulation being drafted, then this should be prepared and then reviewed by the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget. So they will review the proposed rule before introducing it to public. So this is the fifth step. Once the new regulation is drafted, is reviewed, basically it will be proposed to the public. And then they are searching, or they are basically awaiting public comments. So then the public society can comment on the requirements, can provide their feedback before the final rule will be then prepared. And again, there will be a final round for negotiation. And this is then the last step. So basically then the Office of Management and Budget will finally review the comments, will include those, and will then at the end basically publicate the final rule, and then it is in force. So let's have a look on existing drafts, but also on already the first final rule. So as you can see on that slide on the left side, basically the rule-making process, so you don't need to know all the abbreviations like REEN, ANPR, M, and the final rule, but from the top to below, this is basically the process from the first draft to the final rule. And as you can see, there are some rules already in draft, and one rule is already announced, and we will come to that in a minute. But also you can imagine that there is still a long-lasting process and long-lasting way to adopt these requirements. So each of the rule, let's pick the first one, needs to go through all the individual steps from the first draft until the final rule. And to come up with an example, the final rule, the occupant protection for vehicles with automated driving systems, took almost 2 years from the very first draft until the final rule. So now I want to spend a few minutes on the final rule about occupant protection for vehicles with automated driving systems. So this is the very first final rule introduced by NHTSA, which will be effective from September 26 this year. However, it's already compliant and permitted. If you want to use that rule, you can already basically adopt it prior to the effective date. This rule applies to two types of automated driving systems. First, it applies to conventional seating, so just forward-facing front seating. So it does not apply to basically vehicles where maybe the seats are not directing to the front. It also applies to occupant-less vehicles, for example, delivery vehicles without a driver or without passenger in the car, so basically smaller delivery cars. The purpose is to update the existing FMVSS requirements. Because, as I mentioned, the existing ones have been drafted without knowing that there is a new technology, without basically having a driver or no driver on the driver's seat anymore. This is the purpose, to update those FMVSS requirements to the latest technology. However, this final rule is just applicant for the crashworthiness standards. In the US, we call it the 200 series. So FMVSS 200, 201, 202, and the following. So all of those standards are applicable for crashworthiness, and this final rule is only, or the scope of this rule is only with the crashworthiness. So let's talk about the 3 key takeaways. So the first key takeaway you should keep in mind is that this is to update existing regulations, to prepare basically for the emerging autonomous driving systems. And this could serve as a kind of a model, a role model, to update also other FMVSS requirements, like the 100 series, like the 300 series, so that also other requirements will be updated. Secondly, the industry stakeholders should be prepared for further US government oversight to steer the direction of the innovation and safety in vehicles involving with that technology. So basically, it should steer in the right direction. And lastly, to increase federal action demonstrates the need to develop proactively the legal strategy. So basically, it's quite important that the government is updating and is developing new standards and requirements to navigate basically the regulatory landscape. There are also research projects existing in the United States or technical reports. The most famous one is called FMVSS Considerations for Vehicles with ADS, so Automated Driving Systems. And this research was done by NHTSA and by a university. So this project or this research project was also serving as a baseline for that final rule I just mentioned. So that final rule we just talked about was basically also basing on that research project. And within that research project, which was NHTSA sponsored, it was about to identify the unintended barriers, regulatory barriers to basically support the self-certification system with the barriers currently being in place. Also to provide a technical translation of the FMVSS and compliance test procedures. And lastly, it was also focusing on vehicles that lack manual operational driving controls, like steering wheel, like braking pedals, and so on. So this was also focusing that the language can be changed for vehicles without a steering wheel anymore. There are several volumes, so this was the technical report. You can find it online and download it online, and there are several volumes existing. Every volume considers different requirements, so different FMVSS requirements. The first volume was focusing on 12 FMVSS. You can see them listed up on the left side of that slide. And as I mentioned, the purpose was to translate the current FMVSS language into a new language, including automation and autonomous driving. So the first volume was introduced in April 2020, followed by the second volume, which was then introduced in January 2021. And the second volume was focusing on 18 FMVSS requirements. So those 18 are not the same, so they haven't just added 6 additional requirements, but this report builds on the first module. And at the end, as I mentioned, both of those research reports have led into the final rule, which I just introduced, which will come into force in September. So what happens if there are still requirements a vehicle cannot fulfill? There is still the possibility to seek for an exemption. So this is also done through the authority, through NHTSA. So basically, there is still the possibility, and I have 2 examples. On the left side, you can see an example about a low-speed vehicle. And in that case, as you can see on the vehicle, that vehicle hasn't had any mirrors, nor have it had any, basically, pedals. So at the end, there was an exemption for exterior, interior mirrors, and other FMVSS requirements. On the right side, you can see a zero-emission autonomous vehicle, which also applied for several exemptions. So you can see that there is not only 2 or 3 of the exemptions, but rather 10 or 15. And this already gives you some idea that there is still a long way to go to not work with exemptions, but rather to apply regulations. So beside the requirements, there are also guidelines existing, drafted and developed by NHTSA. One of the federal guidelines preparing for the future of transportation is called the Autonomous Vehicle Comprehensive Plan. So this is only a guideline. This is not an enforceable regulation. But it basically promotes collaboration and transparency. It modernizes the regulatory environment, and it prepares the transportation system. So at the end, this is a guideline mostly used for the states. So they should follow these guidelines, prepared, drafted, and at the end also published by federal government. And as you can see on the right side, there are several versions. So it started with the version 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, and the latest version introduced last year, was the comprehensive plan. And one of the initiatives out of that comprehensive plan was the so-called Autonomous Vehicle Test Initiative. So the goal of that initiative is to provide the public with direct and easy access to information about testing of autonomous cars across the whole United States, provide information about the companies who are testing, about the cars which are tested. So basically, this is also publicly available. So you can enter that homepage and you will see exactly the states where testing is conducted in the US. You will also see what kind of cars are being tested, whether it's passenger cars, robo-taxis, whether it's bus shuttles. And you will also see the companies behind who are testing these cars on public roads. So this creates transparency in these times, introducing new technologies. NHTSA also introduced within one of these guidelines, it was the second guideline I mentioned, they also introduced a voluntary safety self-assessment, in short called VSSA. So this is, as the name is telling you, voluntary, but it's highly recommended that the manufacturers who are working on level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5 vehicles, that they use that template which is existing online. You can download it, use that template to basically provide the safety concept the company is having in place. So basically, in other words, with that, the companies are providing to the public on how safety was addressed. And today, almost 30 VSSA have been published. You can also see the companies on the lower side of that slide. So almost every major OEM is basically publishing the VSSA to the public. And then everyone can basically download that VSSA and go through it and have a look at how was safety basically addressed. So let's have a look at the states, which is becoming a little more complex because, as you can see, it's rather a kind of a patchwork, unfortunately. So when we talk about federal, then for sure it's applicable for the whole country, for the whole US. But when we talk about states, they're basically coming up with their own regulations and requirements. And as you can see on the map, basically there are states which allow the full deployment. So deployment means also commercial use for autonomous cars, even without a human operator, such as California, Florida, Michigan, Nevada, and many more. There are also states existing that allow testing without a human operator. So testing means that basically it's not for commercial use, but only for the manufacturers to test their cars on public road. And states here, as an example, would be Washington or Ohio, which are applying these requirements. There are also states existing which allow for full deployment, so again, to commercialize, but with having a safety driver or a human operator in the car. And this would be the District of Columbia. And then there is also states which allow testing, but with a human operator. So basically then you can test on public road, but you need to have someone in the car to still operate the car in case of any emergency. And states, as an example here, would be Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, or Connecticut. So let's take the example of New York. So basically, to regulate self-driving cars, to test on public roads, but with having a safety driver in the driver's seat or on the passenger seat. So entering the state of New York, beside the federal requirements, New York requires companies to apply for a permit for testing. So basically you need to pay a fee, you need to apply for it before you enter the New York state. Then also it requires to self-certify that the safety driver is able to take over the control. And also the companies need to provide test data. So let's have a look at California, which is a little more open compared to New York. So in California, as you can see on the chart on the left side, almost 95% are basically using it for testing. Although deployment would be able. So they could deploy for commercial use, but most is done on testing. So only 5% of the companies are utilizing California for deployment. Out of the 95% for testing, 80% is using it with a driver. So also here interesting to see that still, even if it's allowed, the maturity is still using a driver or a safety operator beside handling it driverless. So now I want to also talk about industry standards. So now we have learned that federal systems are in place, or federal requirements. We've learned that state requirements are in place, but there are also industry standards for autonomous vehicles. And it is highly recommended by the US to adopt these guidelines, that best practices and principles, such as ISO standards, SAE standards, IEEE standards, or any other standard. And this is also used basically, or it is also common that new industry standards are being developed for autonomous vehicles. So multiple standardization bodies are currently developing standards for autonomous driving. And at the end, these standards might also be adapted within their federal requirements. So some of the FMVSS are already referring to SAE, ISO, IEEE standards. So at the end, also these industry standards might become mandatory when they have been introduced in the federal level. So talking about standards, I also wanted to be more practical here. So within the latest guideline provided by NHTSA, the comprehensive plan, you can find that map, which you can see on the left side, about industry standards, and they basically call out cybersecurity standards, such as ISO 21434. They call out functional safety standards, such as 26262. They call out SOTIF 21448. They talk about testing, so testing of autonomous cars, which is referring to SAE J3018 or AVSC best practices, so this is an association. But there are also overall safety standards, such as the UL 4600. And beside that, there are also general standards existing on the operational design domain, but also human-machine interface standards, which can be applicable depending on the use case. So let's have a look at the suggested path on how to update the infrastructure of standards, of regulations for new technologies. So first of all, we need to understand the risks. So basically, we need to understand how driver assistance or how autonomous technology should perform. So this is done with collecting many data. Then the next step would be to develop and to modernize the FMVSS standards for autonomous vehicles. So on the one hand, to update the existing ones, but also to implement new requirements. Then also, it's important to include industry standards. So the evaluation basically, or it's also important to not only focus on federal and on state, but also to include the industry standards which are applicable for the vehicles. And then finally, to continuously update the FMVSS. So that will be still a long-lasting process in the next couple of years to continuously update and implement new regulations. So let's have a quick summary. So first of all, automated and autonomous vehicles can be tested and can be deployed within specific operational design domains on public roads in the United States. So again, as I mentioned, it's quite important to understand that before entering the state, you need to check what kind of state requirements are in place, because the state requirements may vary from state to state, whether you are allowed to deploy, whether you're allowed to test, or whether you're allowed to deploy and test, also depending on with or without human driver. Then also manufacturers that use vehicles that do not comply with the FMVSS, like having, as an example, no mirrors, they are still the way for asking for exemptions or applying for exemptions. And also, as I mentioned, just complying with the FMVSS might not be sufficient and enough. So also due to the product liability, it's quite important that established standards such as SAE, ISO, IEEE, UL, and others are taken into consideration. So nowadays, the certification system allows a kind of a race of deployment in the US. So as you can see on the latest news, the US clears the way for truly driverless vehicles without a steering wheel. Self-driving trucks can be on highways by 2023. Self-driving car companies zoom ahead, leaving the regulators behind. So these are quite common news in the US because there is really a race based on the technology, but the regulators are sometimes a little behind. However, it's very important to understand that it must be a safe race, which is essential for the market acceptance and to achieve the goal of less fatalities and safer roads. So in contrast, we also know that NHTSA, as I mentioned, they are collecting data. So within the last 10 months, basically collected data based on crashes of autonomous and ADAS-based vehicles. And within the last 10 months, almost 400 crashes happened. So this is also quite sensitive topic because there must be also proper guidelines in place to still ensure the safety and the security before deploying these cars on the road. So how can we build trust in autonomous vehicle safety is really essential, and I'm gonna provide three basically approaches on how we can build trust with these new technologies. So first of all, to reach a level of transparency. So share the information with the involved and the key stakeholders, such as the authorities, such as independent service providers, the public, on how the automated driving are being developed, tested, and integrated into the system. And this can be done in the US with the initiatives, as mentioned, the VSSA, the Voluntary Safety Self-Assessment, or the AV Test Initiative. Secondly, having an assessment of safety and security according to the regulations, standards, and best practices is quite important. So AV manufacturers partially obtain independent certification by a technical service provider to basically strengthen their compliance with the relevant regulations, standards, and best practices. And this can be done by TÜV SÜD, for example. So we conduct independent safety and security assessments of these technologies before entering public roads to avoid the news we have seen before. And lastly, the development and the adoption of a uniform approach is quite important. So all the states should follow the guidelines, that we avoid having a patchwork and avoid that we have 50 individual state requirements and federal requirements. So it's quite important to also have a uniform approach, and that can be done by following the guidelines. And I will basically end my speech with that phrase. So the critical path to introduce autonomous driving vehicles will not be the technology, but the development of a metric which empowers for an approval. Thanks for listening.